The United Nations says it's a military escalation that's putting millions of lives at risk. One of the last government strongholds and a safe haven for displaced civilians in Yemen is under attack. Can a seismic shift in U.S. policy quell the violence and restart peace talks? Or is it adding fuel to the fire? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Yemen. Although the war in Yemen began as a civil conflict in 2014, it quickly escalated into a proxy war between competing global powers. The Arab monarchies of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, supplied with weapons from the West, faced off against Houthi rebels backed by Iran. The result of their years of fighting has created the world's worst humanitarian disaster, with millions of Yemeni civilians deprived of safety, food, and shelter. But last week, U.S. President Joe Biden reset Washington's role in Yemen, reversing a Trump-era policy and pausing all further sales of U.S. weapons to Saudi Arabia. He also removed the Houthis from the list of designated terrorist organizations. But with the Houthi rebels now advancing on the city of Marib, how far can any U.S. efforts go to de-escalate the war? Here's Natalie Beholden.
These are pro-government forces firing on Houthi positions west of Marib in Yemen. The region, which is rich in oil and gas, has become a flashpoint. It's the last northern stronghold of Yemen's Saudi-backed government. But the rebels, allied with Iran, have stepped up their offensive to take over this territory. Some observers say the move appears to be motivated in part to gain strategic leverage in any future peace negotiations. The UN has warned that the fighting here could put 2 million civilians at risk. It's calling for de-escalation to avoid unimaginable humanitarian consequences. This area is already home to camps hosting hundreds of thousands of people who've been displaced over the course of the civil war that started more than 6 years ago. The local aid group running this facility in Marib says hundreds of internally displaced people have arrived in recent days. There's little they can offer. Off camera, a woman says, "Tell them how we are living. The situation is very hard. There is nothing, no gas, no toilets, nothing."
We hope that displaced people will not be targeted because it results in many huge humanitarian problems and burdens that neither us nor the government can deal with.
One more tragedy on the horizon for the Yemeni people who've already endured so much.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
In Joe Biden's first foreign policy speech as Commander-in-Chief, he outlined a stark shift on US policy towards Yemen. Over the course of the war, the US has sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Saudi-led coalition that backs the internationally recognized Yemeni government. Biden's administration says diplomacy is now the key. It wants to see the restoration of peace talks. It hasn't said whether it will encourage allies like the UK to stop their arms sales to the Saudis. The State Department is also revoking the terrorist designation applied to the Houthis during Donald Trump's last days in office. That move means much-needed aid deliveries for civilians can get through, and that's crucial because most of the population lives in areas under Houthi control. But at the same time that the US and the UN are pushing for a lasting political solution, the rebels have also stepped up drone attacks on Saudi soil. It makes the already complex task of bringing all of the relevant parties to the negotiating table even more complicated.
I think, our hope is that a combined effort, bringing in certain partners at certain times, backed with a strong, very strong American position, will essentially shake up the architecture and put us in a much better place to push for that negotiated settlement, which I think we all agree is the only way forward.
The alternative for Yemen's people is unthinkable. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington is Anel Shalin, a research fellow with the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute. From Sana'a, we have Hussein al-Bukhaiti. He's a Yemeni journalist. And David Harden is a former USAID Assistant Administrator for Yemen and the Managing Director of the Georgetown Strategy Group. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me begin with the apparent shift here in U.S. policy and what you think is behind it. Anel, is the U.S. aiming to end the war in Yemen, or can they only end U.S. complicity in it?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the swiftness with which the Biden administration moved is commendable. Clearly, the situation in Yemen is dire, and I think a lot of people in the Biden administration were trying to fix mistakes made in the past under the Obama administration. However, as we've seen, especially with the ongoing humanitarian crisis playing out right now in Marib as the Houthis advance against the millions of Yemenis, over a million Yemenis who have been displaced there. Clearly, the lifting of the FTO designation has been seen as or I would consider perhaps necessary given the feedback that was being provided by aid groups, but at the same time, insufficiently considered of what was going to happen in terms of Houthis then feeling emboldened to advance on Marib. I do think it's important to keep in mind that this has been a long-term Houthi goal. They've been trying to take Marib for over a year. So, and moving forward, I do think this notion that Biden can simply end the war is inaccurate. That I think most of what Biden can do is to try to pressure for foreign intervention to cease, to pressure U.S. partners, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to fully withdraw from Yemen and commit to funding reconstruction and contributing to peace efforts. But at the moment, the concern is really with the Houthis and their acts of belligerence, I think, are the most urgent question at the moment. And Biden doesn't really have leverage over them. And finally, that the FTO designation didn't necessarily give him leverage. The Houthis are isolated from the international community. But again, it may have been seen by them or interpreted as sort of a symbolic move, that by lifting this, they felt that perhaps the U.S. wasn't going to intervene or otherwise try to prevent their advance.
Okay, Hussein, I'll let you make your views clear here. How much are the Houthis responsible for the deaths of millions of civilians in Yemen and their displacements? Is it mostly on the rebels?
No, I think all the blame is toward Saudi Arabia. Either we agree with the Houthi or not. If we call it what they did is a coup or revolution, those type of things has happened in Yemen several times for the last 60 years. But we haven't had this catastrophe and this bad humanitarian situation only because of the outside intervention from Saudi Arabia and other country backed by the United States and UK and France. And the main thing that actually is killing Yemenis and mostly children is the blockade that's enforced on Yemen. This is actually a war crime. Just at this moment, there are 14 oil ships in front of Jazan port in Saudi Arabia. They are not allowed to get into Saudi Arabia, even though they have been searched by the coalition and as well by the United Nations, and there are United Nations staff in the port present. That's why I think all the blame is on the coalition, because they are the one who has brought this outside intervention to Yemen. And of course, if the battle in Marib, I'm sure that of course that hundreds of thousands of Yemeni civilians will be affected by that, but we should know that this actually the blame is on the governor of Marib and the people who are in control of Marib, what's called the legitimacy, because they are allowing Marib to be a base for foreign troops from Saudi Arabia and other country to target Sana'a area and Sana'a forces. And I think if Marib doesn't want their city to be attacked or to be liberated, as it says here in Sana'a, they should not allow it to become a base for foreign power.
Okay, Hussein, let me get a third opinion then. Dave, I'll let you say your piece here. We know this is an extremely complex conflict, but does one party bear heavily more responsibility than another?
Well, thank you for having me on again, Andrea. What Biden did is shifted responsibility to the Houthis, right? The Houthis are the one party in control of the humanitarian crisis that can change the trajectory tomorrow. They can open up access for their people who are suffering in the north. They can unlock the keys to the FSO Sapphire, which is an environmental time bomb sitting off the coast of Hodeidah, and they can deconflict Marib. Biden gave them an opportunity, and right now they're choosing to ignore that opportunity and inflict pain and suffering on the Yemeni people yet again.
Okay, Hussein, a quick response to that. Very quickly, if you can.
I mean, when he said the access, I mean, the main access for 70% of the humanitarian aid that's coming from for Yemen, as the United States said, is Hodeidah port. And Hodeidah port is closed. And you can check marine radar. It will show you how many ships are blocked from entering Hodeidah. That's why Saudi is responsible for that, not the Houthis.
Okay. You know what, Hussein, actually, I'm going to stick with you for a second, because one of the reasons, you know, the Trump policy was what it was because of the Houthi alliance, obviously, with Iran. I know you can't really answer this as objectively, maybe, as I'd like, but in your opinion, just how beholden are the Houthis to Iran? Is it temporarily strategic or more permanently ideological?
As mainly there is like a political relation, and Iran is supporting Yemen in a type like through media and supporting the case of Yemen. But I mean, I believe that Iran cannot actually send ballistic missile to Yemen. A ballistic missile is 8 to 12 meter long. I mean, the Saudi have this blockade on Yemen. How can you smuggle this weapon? And let's be clear. If it's really true that Iran found a way to send weapons to Yemen, I mean, why then the Saudi have started this war and have enforced this blockade on Yemen? This means that this blockade that have killed more than 300 Yemeni civilians to stop the weapons, and if the weapons still come into Yemen, I can say that Yemenis have the right to get the weapons from anywhere. I mean, the Saudi weapons is not made in Saudi farms somewhere inside Saudi Arabia. It's coming all the way from the United States. So the Yemenis, they have the right to make weapons. If they can as well buy weapons, they have the right to buy weapons wherever they want to defend their country. Or even if you call them only the Houthi, they have the right. And about Biden administration, just a quick response about the removal of Houthi from that list. That removal, it has put us back to the 17th of January. And what's before 17th of January is 6 years of Saudi war and blockade. So it has not changed anything on the ground. And Houthi are clear. Any decision is taken by the United States, if it not will have any effect to stop the war on Yemen, they will continue target Saudi Arabia, and they will continue to liberate every corner of Yemen.
Okay. Nell, actually, if I can pick up on the question I asked Hussein with you, because I'm not sure the answer is that clear. Are the Houthis genuinely beholden to Iran? Is this genuinely a partner for the Houthis, or is this simply the logistical and military support that they need to continue fighting for what they want for Yemen, ultimately? Because obviously U.S. policy was geared toward isolating and punishing Iran via punishing the Houthis.
Right. I think it's a mistake to view Yemen through the lens of Biden's sort of broader regional agenda having to do with Iran. There was sort of a revealing exchange where a spokesperson from Iran sent a message to the Houthis saying, you know, we welcome your continuing of our proud revolution from 1979. And the response from the Houthis was, you know, look, we've been doing this for thousands of years. You know, this is not about you. This is about us. So I think it's just important to keep in mind the Houthis are not Iranian puppets. And so even if Biden sort of hoped that perhaps by lifting the FTO designation that might sort of smooth the gears for future negotiations with Iran, it's Iran is concerned about what's happening within Iran. Iran is facing its own crisis as a result of U.S. sanctions, and from their perspective, the Houthis have offered an opportunity to antagonize Saudi Arabia, to pull Saudi Arabia into this war, to continue to expend massive amounts of resources on it, and so from their perspective, it's sort of a low-cost means of antagonizing their main rival. But even if if Biden was able to convince Iran to stop providing any kind of support to the Houthis would continue to pursue their objectives. It is, they're interested in asserting control over especially the former North Yemen, and just from what we know about civil wars in general, that as long as there continues to be foreign funding, the civil war is going to continue. And so I think the most important objective here for the Biden administration is to get the US and UAE to stop interfering and contributing to the resources funding the war, and if possible to get Iran to stop as well. But then to keep in mind that will not stop the war. This is still an internal domestic Yemeni conflict. However, the hope is that by shifting those incentives and cutting off this flow of unending resources, dynamics would shift somewhat, and in particular that there are Yemenis within Yemen who are fighting on the side of the Houthis right now because they're opposed to Saudi intervention. But if all foreign intervention cease, there are a lot of Yemenis who also don't want Houthi control. And so I think the most important objective right now for the Biden administration is to get to all foreign intervention to cease.
Okay. So Dave, as for the U.S., stopping those weapon sales to Saudi, how dependent is Saudi really on those weapons in achieving what it wants to achieve in Yemen?
Look, the United States wants to not be entangled in Yemen. There's no interest in continued and deeper U.S. involvement in Yemen from a military perspective. Saudi Arabia, of course, has the right to defend itself, but Saudi Arabia wants an exit. The Houthis simply could open up access to the FSO Safar oil tanker today for the UN. They could coordinate with the World Food Program for clear and unambiguous distribution to the people that need it, and they could do a humanitarian pause in Marib tomorrow. The entire world has given the Houthis an opportunity. And what the Houthis have done for the last 9 days is spit in Biden's face, okay? So they will have the blood on their hand of the Yemeni people who die in the north. Stop blaming Saudi Arabia. Stop blaming the United States. Right now, it's a new ball game, and it's your opportunity.
Again, Hussein, Houthi intransigents.
It is called the Saudi-led coalition. Yeah, I mean, when he said stop to blame Saudi Arabia, it's called the Saudi-led coalition intervention on Yemen. You can Google it if you are not sure. I mean, this is a war that was launched on Yemen, despite you agree with the Houthi or not. And we can ask about for the Houthi, as you said, to make access for humanitarian to reach Yemen. But first, before we ask them that, we have to ask the United Nations and the United States and Saudi to lift the blockade. They can lift the blockade, allow all food ship and medicine and everything that will help the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. If they do that, then after that we can see, will the situation change or not? If it's not going to change, this means at that time we can blame the Houthi. But as long and about just the sales of weapons and the intervention of the United States, the sales of weapons is not a daily product. Saudi doesn't receive it every day. If Biden has stopped now the sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, there are contracts that have signed in the previous years, and some contracts it will take 5 or 3 years, 2 years, 5 years for Saudi to reach the Saudi. And the Saudi have at this moment, I'm sure, stockpiles of weapons. They have struck the largest military sales agreement with Obama administration, the largest in U.S. history. So for this decision from Biden, it's just he wants to deceive the international community. And on the other hand, he say we will keep supporting Saudi Arabia to defend itself from ballistic missile and other attack. This means he wants to protect Saudi Arabia from those attacks that maybe they can hurt Saudi Arabia to stop the war. And if the Saudi are not hurt by this ballistic missile because of the United States, this means that they can continue their war. United States should call the Saudi to stop the war as they are calling Sana'a or the Houthi to stop their attack against Saudi Arabia. We should be fair enough and to do so for a ceasefire.
Hussein, thank you. Anel, I need to move on to an even tougher question with you. On what grounds could there be negotiations, if that's what we're moving toward? How do you envision an actual solution here via diplomacy?
Yeah, so again, as I said, I think the most important first priority is to cease all foreign intervention. Again, that at the moment there is, the Houthis are able to benefit from this narrative that they are fighting against the foreign invaders, foreign attackers led by the Saudis. And so again, to shift the dynamics towards shift the incentives so that the actors within Yemen are able to reassess their priorities. If they don't have these additional resources flowing in, then it'll be a question of Yemenis versus Yemenis. And as my colleague said, you know, the Houthis bear much responsibility for the current humanitarian crisis. And so there are many Yemenis who are unwilling and to have the Houthis take over control of their country. But at the moment, their main focus is repelling the outsiders. So for Biden, his most important priority is to get the Saudis and Emiratis to completely withdraw. And we need to remember that the Emirates continues to hold key infrastructure in Yemen, including the island of Socotra, continue to hold and torture prisoners, and continue to provide support for the Southern Transitional Council. So that's the first priority. And as I said, we shouldn't think of the Houthis as an Iranian puppet. And so I don't think we should wait and hold Yemen hostage to eventual negotiations with Iran, because Iran's involvement with the Houthis, it's there, but the Houthis are going to continue to do what they do regardless of what Iran does. So again, the first priority is returning this to an internal Yemeni conflict. And then at that point, the Biden administration should insist that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and preferably Iran, and the United States and European partners all should be on the hook for reparations to fund reconstruction of Yemen, and most specifically that the provision of such funds should be predicated on the maintenance of small local ceasefires, so that local power holders on the ground will then be incentivized to keep the peace. And
my question, though, Anel, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, because I was moving even further ahead, perhaps too far ahead. I was really wanting to know, as an observer that knows the country as well as you do, how you envision a post-conflict Yemen. Who is in control where? Will we see another north-south divide, for example? Would that be a potential compromise to bring peace?
We may see another north-south divide. At the moment, you know, it's sort of hard to know, because I think moving forward, what the Biden administration should support is a comprehensive and inclusive peace process that brings all relevant Yemeni actors to the table. And this is part of, in my understanding, why the Houthis are pushing so hard, is they want to sort of assert the facts on the ground that they are the most powerful, to give them that much of a bigger spot at the negotiating table, and that this ultimately would not lead to a sustainable peace. It's very important that all relevant factors and actors, groups within Yemen, are brought to that eventual negotiating table, because otherwise the peace will not be sustainable. You know, a peace, if Biden was hoping to sort of end in sort of the southern, the STC controls the south and the Houthis control the north, and now he could wash his hands of it, that's not going to be sustainable, and it is going to result in further fighting. And so moving forward, it is crucial that all relevant actors are empowered and brought to the table, including all of the members who participated in Yemen's national dialogue. I think a lot of Yemenis continue to see that, although it was flawed, although it was not perfect, but they continue to look to that as a model for how to move towards a more inclusive form of government, and that there are many people in Yemen who really want to return to that. On the other hand, it is important to not hold this hostage to President Hadi, who has been unwilling to step down or to move along in order to make room for a figure who might be seen as more acceptable to a broader population. But for now, Hadi is all we have, and so I think at the moment it would be useful if he would leave Riyadh. At the moment, he's sort of sitting pretty in Riyadh, and to actually be but again, it's difficult for him
Okay.
because he's just has to do what the Saudis tell him.
Right.
So
Anel,
moving
I'm going to have to interrupt you. I mean, we really are down to our final minute. And Dave, I wanted to just fit in one last question with you. I'm not sure you'll think this is relevant, or you might find it entirely relevant, because it's something we haven't brought up in this discussion, and I haven't heard brought up in many discussions, but I have heard from analysts on the ground that this is a serious issue. And that is the presence of active terrorist groups, not least Al-Qaeda, in the Arabian Peninsula, providing another destabilizing force that no one has had time to really address or deal with given the conflict. Do you think this is an element that could raise its very ugly head if the country does move toward peace negotiations?
Absolutely. Both Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS are operating in Yemen. And those are threats, not only to the stability of the Arabian Peninsula, but of the entire region and the world. But at this moment, the Houthis are the stronger party. Biden made a diplomatic initiative. It's crystal clear. He's not deceiving the world, Hussein. And it's up to the Houthis to respond with a diplomatic move back. If they want to have any legitimacy, we need a diplomatic move. You can open up the FSO Safar tanker to the UN. You can facilitate humanitarian assistance, or you can pause in Marib. But wait a minute, Hussein, I want you to give one diplomatic move. Open up the FSO Safar.
Hussein, unfortunately, I can't give you a final word. We are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers, but I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for being with us, and thanks to our viewers for joining us as well. See you next time.